مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. دونالد ترامب هو الرئيس الوحيد على الإطلاق الذي تم عزله مرتين في مجلس النواب. أولا لاستخدام الأجندات السياسية في سياسته حيال أوكرانيا، وثانيا بسبب دوره في الاعتداء على مبنى الكابيتول في 6 يناير. هو الرئيس الوحيد الذي برأه مجلس الشيوخ الأميركي مرتين بفضل الأكثرية الجمهورية التي صوتت لحمايته. لكن هل سيكون دونالد ترامب أيضا الرئيس الوحيد على الإطلاق الذي سيتهم بجريمة جنائية؟ وبعد كل ما حصل على مدى الأعوام ال6 الماضية، هل سيحاكم بسبب دفع مالية غير قانونية دفعها لإسكات عشيقة؟ هل هذا الاتهام من المدعي العام في نيويورك يعني النهاية الأخيرة لمسيرة زعيم حركة أمريكا أولا، أم أن هذا الاتهام سيعطي حياة جديدة لحملته الرئاسية التي تنازع؟ كيف سيؤثر هذا الاتهام في حاضر ومستقبل الحزب الجمهوري؟ هناك الكثير لمناقشته، ونحن محظوظون باستضافة 3 مراقبين سياسيين محترمين لتحليل كل وجه هذه القصة الهامة جدا. بيل كريستال، نايومي ليم، وجيسيكا تايلور. Welcome back to Dakhil Washington. By the time this show airs, Donald Trump may be the first ex-president ever to be indicted for a criminal offense. Well, what are the implications? Is this the nail in the coffin of his already stumbling presidential ambitions? Or is it just what he needs to get back on the front pages again and again and again? To discuss the politics of the likely Trump indictment and other political issues swirling in Washington today, I'm pleased to welcome a terrific panel. Bill Crystal, Naomi Lim, and Jessica Taylor. So thank you all very much for joining. Jessica, first, the facts. If the Manhattan District Attorney does get a grand jury to indict former President Trump, what's the charge?
So this would be for allegedly paying off Stormy Daniels, a former porn star. The charges go back to even before when he ran for president, that she had salacious material about their affair. It's quite complicated, and sort of fits into the Trump image that he had before he ran as a celebrity playboy, and different things. And so all of this goes back to whether funds were misappropriated and misused and misspent on this, and whether it was covered up. So it's the cover up that always gets you in this. This isn't some grand conspiracy of something that happened during his presidency or different things, though there are other pending charges, particularly in Georgia right now, that we're also watching of him, a call that the president made in the aftermath of the 2020 election, trying to get the Secretary of State there to overturn the result. There's also charges that could come out of that, racketeering perhaps, and different things. But this is hush money, essentially. And so whether this has come back to bite him at this time as he is launching another bid for president, we will see. But there's been speculation in Washington whether, Trump was sort of Teflon when he ran the first time. All of these things didn't seem to matter. But when we look at the subsequent elections, 2018, 2020, and 2022, where we saw voters reject his party and his candidates, especially in 2022, candidates that he backed, there isn't as much anymore. But the way that the Republican field is shaping up, there's still a very good chance that he can be the nominee, because if it's a fractured field, as we're seeing with Ron DeSantis as the primary opponent, and other candidates splitting up the anti-Trump vote, there's still very much a way that he can win the nomination, because the way the Republican vote goes is it's largely winner take all instead of proportional as it is for Democrats. So, does this help or hurt him? I don't think an indictment helps anyone. I mean, Trump's always going to claim victim status, and they're badgering me, and they're out to get me in different things. But I think it just further reminds at least general election voters why they soured on him, even if they may have liked some of the things he did as president, that it was just this chaos candidate, and chaos sort of surrounds him. And
so let me pursue this with Naomi. Specifically, no one, as Jessica just said, no one likes to be charged with a criminal offense. But is this necessarily good or bad news for the former president?
I think the general understanding is that this sort of helps the former president in a primary context. Whether that sort of translates to the general election is another issue. I mean, we've seen him fundraise over the weekend to the tune of, over $1 million. And we're sort of hearing from people in Trump world that he is kind of thinking about the optics of what an indictment looks like, whether he wants to take part in a perp walk where he sort of walked out in front of cameras before he has his mugshot taken, as well as fingerprinting. So he's playing into that. I mean, as you sort of say, it's also creating fractures within the Republican candidates, declared and undeclared, that who could potentially contest the nomination. We're sort of seeing Florida Governor Ron DeSantis kind of split hairs, where he sort of says that, I don't know, I can't relate to having to pay money to keep an affair with a porn star silent, but also, is this prosecution or persecution? Should we be paying, or should we be taking charges seriously from what they say is a George Soros Democratic super donor funded prosecutors? So it's sort of interesting to see how potential candidates in the field are reacting to the developments.
So, Bill, you're an intimate observer, a recovering Republican. I don't know what term you want to use. How do you think the party, such as it is today, is going to react to its standard bearer under indictment?
So far, it's clearly rallied to him, at least in making the case that the indictment is unfair and seems like a political indictment and a legal stretch. They can do that without necessarily supporting him for president. Obviously, Ron DeSantis has tried to, remind people that of the porn star hush money side of it, while sort of defending Trump on the actual indictment, and reminding everyone that Alvin Bragg was supported by George Soros, which I guess is the worst thing the worst word you can say, one of the worst words you can say in a Republican primary context. I mean, I think if you step back, though, first of all, we don't know, right? That there could be 2, 3, 4 indictments. 9, 10 months from now, 11 months from now, when people start voting, we could know a lot more. It could look a lot worse to a degree where people really say, geez, this is just too much. And even if I don't want Trump to go to jail, I don't think we should nominate him again. That would help DeSantis a lot. Or it could look 10 or 11 months from now like a bunch of complicated legal cases, which are all mired down in appeals, and conceivably 1 or 2 of them hasn't even panned out. And Republican voters could say to themselves, look at them, they're going after Trump for a reason. He's our strongest guy. He was the one who won the presidency. We should never forget that in 2016, for all the talk about how weak he is. He's the one Republican who's won a presidential race since 2004, and inside straight, electoral college and all that, but still. And you can imagine people rallying to Trump. So I think it's very, a lot depends on what we learn. A lot depends on the psychology of Republican primary voters, how Trump looks, how DeSantis looks. I mean, if you just step back one more point, DeSantis had a very good 2022. I mean, he started the year as a Republican governor, well thought of, hopeful, presidential hopeful, one among many. He ended the year as clearly the leading alternative to Trump. He won re-election in Florida by 19 points, having won by 1 point when he originally ran. And so you got to say that DeSantis, I mean, that was a pretty impressive performance. How many people have done that? And Obama might be the best comparison, in a kind of off year, surging to the front of the pack in so decisive a way. He played various culture war cards and so forth. He's a little rockier time now that he's actually in a serious presidential contest for the nomination, and we'll see how he does. A lot depends on his performance too, not just on what Trump does. So I think very hard to say exactly where we'll be 10, 11 months. I don't think it's a knockout blow for Trump. I don't think it's necessarily a help for Trump. And in the Trump years, it's hard to predict these things.
So for the first time in a while, we actually have someone else who could claim mantle as as chief Republican in the country. We do have a Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives, and we have long-serving Mitch McConnell in the Senate, chief Senate Republican. How are elected Republicans in Washington reacting or likely to react to the former president being under indictment? Naomi?
So what we're seeing, I mean, it was interesting, the split screen focus between reporters outside the courthouse or the district attorney's office in Manhattan, and with the Republican House conference that they were having in Orlando, Florida. We had sort of Kevin McCarthy saying, this was personal money that the former president spent on sort of mitigating or hushing up or keeping quiet the alleged affair with Stormy Daniels. And from that same conference, we had a joint letter by top Republicans, for example, Jim Jordan from Ohio, who sits on the Judiciary Committee, asking or basically sort of requesting that Alan Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney, testify in front of Congress. And that decision is sort of gaining sort of support in the House. Senators, the Republican senators sort of are a little bit squeamish about that, just because the Congress doesn't have oversight over these state prosecutions. So we're sort of seeing, again, and I think this will be definitely a test for House Republicans. We know that Trump world, or particularly Trump, loves when his allies are very loud and vocal in his support. And again, that might test McCarthy standing within the caucus. But then on the other side, I think we're in that kind of stage where we were in the 2015 primaries, where people were feeling a little bit more liberated in terms of stepping back and criticizing former President Trump. But we'll see where it goes in terms of what the indictments are. And as was mentioned before, I mean, this could be just the first indictment out of the ranks. We have other things coming down in Georgia, as well as developments within the federal investigation into whether Trump was involved in the January 6th Capitol riot, as well as his handling of classified material after he left office.
So, Jessica, are Democrats just letting the Republicans stew in their own juices on this, or are they weighing in as well?
I think they're pretty content to just let Republicans let this play out, because, I mean, you don't want to sort of be seen as egging it on, and that can certainly backfire, because as Bill and everything said, that this prosecutor has been tied to George Soros. They're trying to make this out to be a political witch hunt. So the more hands off that they can take it, but I mean, they're going to gladly sort of see this play out. I mean, I think that they will find a lot of glee. And if there is a perp walk or some mugshot or different things, I mean, this is unprecedented in political times that we have. And as I mentioned, this may not be the last one that we see, because there are, as Naomi said, there's also other prosecutions still out there that could still end up with charges, or at least the Trump associates or Trump adjacent people. So I think they're pretty content to let this play out and let Republicans have their infighting and whatever happens. But, while again, I agree that I think this could give him a boost in the primary election, I still think when we look at the general, it's still a net negative.
All right. When we come back after the break, I'm going to turn to another big topic, which is occupying American politics. Are America's banks fragile? And what is the political fallout from collapse of two big banks? In just a moment. Again, my guests today include Jessica Taylor. Jessica is the Senate and Governors editor for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, and senior author of the most recent edition of the Almanac of American Politics. Previously, she was a political reporter for National Public Radio and NBC News. Also joining us is Naomi Lim. Naomi is White House reporter at the Washington Examiner. Previously, she reported on crime and politics for News Corp in her native Australia. And joining us is Bill Kristol, editor-at-large of The Bulwark, an important voice in the Never Trump movement. One of Washington's leading traditional conservatives, Bill was the founder and editor-at-large of the venerable Weekly Standard. All right, Bill, let me start with you. Huge story, fragility of America's banks. 2 banks failed in the last month. The first bank failures since the onset of the pandemic. Just big picture, is America's financial system in trouble, in your view?
I mean, I think not, but one footnote on a previous discussion, if I may. Sometimes in politics, you can look in details, and Jessica and Naomi know how to do that too, and who's going to do what in which primary. But if you step back and say, where's the momentum? Where's the energy? Who's driving the Republican Party? I think the big story for me is it's still Trump. And one piece of evidence for this, and I think your audience, Rob, is interested in this, is Ukraine. I mean, DeSantis had a wide range of places he could have ended up on Ukraine, ranging from where he was in the House, which would be a much more traditional hawkish stand with our Democratic allies, to all the way over to a kind of pure America first, just forget about it. And he went pretty far in the America first direction and didn't want to let Trump draw a clear contrast with him on Ukraine. What does that tell us? It tells us that DeSantis, who's an intelligent politician and who's doing a lot of polling and focus groups, and is a very calculating politician, I would say, thinks that the energy is still very much on Trump's side of the party. So I think that's important to remember. And I do think that gives Trump a bit of an edge. You're always better off being the original person who's pushing something, usually better off, not always, than the sort of person who's trying to kind of position himself or herself just a little bit on the side, So I think we shouldn't underestimate Trump in that respect. I mean, the banking, blow up of Silicon Valley and then a couple other banks has been a surprise, I think, to a lot of people, maybe including the Fed. Who knows? These things are very unpredictable, as we learned in 2007, 8, and at other times. I think most people don't think it's a huge systemic crisis, that we're tottering, but it will make a difference. I did a conversation, I do these conversations online with Jason Furman, who was Obama's head of the top economist for President Obama. And he was surprisingly to me a little bit pessimistic about the economy, thinks there was odds of recession, probably a little better than 50-50, and said we shouldn't underestimate even if the banking crisis just leads to some constraint of credit, which it probably will. Everyone's going to pull back some, right? A lot of loan, a little less easy to get a loan, and interest rates are up. You add that contraction into the Fed staying pretty hawkish on interest rates, and you could get something of a recession. That might be a good thing. I hate to say it that way, but in terms of ultimately getting us to a reasonable landing out of the inflation we've been in, and laying the groundwork for better growth in the future. But I mean, just politically, to get back to politics and in closing on this, I was in the Bush White House, the first Bush White House, as you know, Rob, in 91, 92. We had a mild recession, honestly. That was a product of pretty good policies, unwinding the S&L crisis, savings loan crisis, for one thing. Fed was hiking rates. It ended up laying the groundwork for a pretty good decade in the 90s, but it laid the groundwork for Bill Clinton, who defeated George H.W. Bush because the economy was shaky. And so I was a little struck in this conversation with Jason Furman, who's a Democrat and supports Joe Biden and all that he's a little more worried than I realized one might be about the next year and a half economically.
So, Jessica, what's the politics here? Who is blaming who for banks failing?
I mean, you have Elizabeth Warren, I think, has clearly, been sort of on that's her biggest issue, saying that, the lack of regulations has sort of led to this, and saying, so you have sort of the progressives and that kind on the Democratic side saying this, whereas, Republicans are saying, well, this is the fault of Biden's economy and different things. I mean, the economy is very nuanced. I don't pretend to be an expert on it, but I mean, I think that right now we expected a more volatile economy to factor into the midterms last year. That ended up not happening because we had so many other outside forces of bad candidates that Trump and Republicans had backed, and abortion and the abortion issue playing in there. So how much I think that the economy will play a bigger issue in a presidential year specifically. So, this is another headache I think that the Biden administration has to deal with, but Republicans also have to answer and say, what would we do differently? And how would we do this when you have these big banks that, that are failing and different things? And is that going to spread, or is this just sort of more of, a Silicon Valley, microcosm there in different things?
I want to thank you, Jessica, Bill, and Naomi. Thank you very much for joining us this week on Dakhel Washington.
Thanks, Rob.
At this moment, as I videotape this essay for our episode of Dakhel Washington, news has not yet broken about the indictment of Donald J. Trump. But if media reports are to be believed, that could change any minute. And when you see this, the outcome will be clear. And if that means the former president has formally been charged with a criminal offense, America has once again taken a leap into uncharted political waters. Just to recap, Donald Trump has spent more time on trial than any president in American history. He was the first to be impeached twice, which means he was the first to face trial twice in the United States Senate. Both of these trials ended with foreordained acquittals, given that the Republicans in the Senate were numerous enough to prevent the necessary 2/3 majority needed for a guilty verdict. If he gets indicted for a third time, this time by a New York grand jury, convinced to do so by the Manhattan district attorney, he could face a different type of court, one not elected by voters in the 50 states, but one chosen from the citizens of the city he once called home. I have to admit, there is something a bit underwhelming about all this. Great issues triggered the two impeachments. In the first case, Trump's alleged abuse of presidential powers in extorting Ukraine to come up with political dirt on the Biden family as a condition of a presidential visit. In the second case, Trump's alleged role in the January 6th assault on the US Capitol. By comparison, the Manhattan case is, well, tawdry. The basic question, if he is indicted, is whether Trump misused campaign funds to have his lawyer pay hush money to a star of pornographic movies so she would keep quiet about a sexual affair she allegedly had with Trump. Not quite the same stuff as the attack on our democracy we all saw on January 6th, more like a titillating miniseries on Netflix. But the details aside, the indictment itself could upend American politics. It could inject new energy into Trump's slumping poll numbers and demoralize political base. It could provide him with a renewed platform to control the news cycle. It could dominate the news, the media, for months and months, sidelining all those new and not so new faces that want to drive a stake through the wounded and battled ex-president. Alternatively, it could be the final straw for enough die-hard Trump fans that they realize their campaign to make America great again, whatever that means, needs a new hero, one unencumbered with these messy complications. Here's my take. Yes, the voters have the ultimate say, and Trump was roundly defeated by Joe Biden in the 2020 election. But in our system, courts have their say too, when the issue is legal, not political. And if the Trump Corporation and Trump's accountant have faced justice and been convicted of crimes, there's no reason why Trump himself should be immune from that fate too. All this is balanced against the realization that Trump will not go quietly in the night. He will use this indictment as an oxygen tank for his flagging political fortunes, which means we will have him in the news and on the airwaves for a long, long time. Just thinking about that makes me long for a stiff drink. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن تأثير متائب الرئيس ترامب قانونية على الحزب الجمهوري، تواصلوا معي رجاء عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو راسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @RobSatloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم، حتى ذلك الحين شكرا وإلى اللقاء.